The sun was a hammer, and the Arizona Territory was its anvil. It beat down on the cracked red earth until the heat shimmered up in waves, distorting the shapes of the saguaros that stood like patient, thorny sentinels. The sky was not blue, but a dome of burning brass, empty of clouds, empty of mercy. Beneath it, Elias Ward rode alone, his horse, Jericho, plodding with a weary, rhythmic gait that kicked up puffs of ochre dust. Each breath Elias took was thick with heat and grit, a constant reminder of the unforgiving nature of the land he called home, though it had never felt like one. He was headed for what was left of Red Creek, a ghost town that had coughed its last breath when the silver vein ran dry. There was nothing there for him but shade and silence, and right now, that was all he wanted. The memories rode with him, heavier than the Colt Peacemaker on his hip or the Winchester in its scabbard. They were ghosts of a different sort, whispering of cannon smoke and the cries of men he had known, and others he had been paid to hunt. The heat was a punishment, he thought, a penance for things a man could not undo. It baked the sweat to his skin and settled deep in his bones, a constant, humming ache that matched the one in his soul. Jericho's ears twitched, and he slowed, lifting his head to test the wind. Elias reined him in, his eyes scanning the desolate landscape. It was a faint sound, almost lost in the buzz of insects and the whisper of the hot wind through brittle brush. A whimper, high and thin, like a coyote pup, but there was a human sorrow in it that made the hairs on Elias's arms stand up. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft, sun-scorched dirt, and led Jericho forward, his hand resting on the worn stock of his rifle. The sound led him to the ghost of a creek bed, a winding scar of pale stones and bleached sand where water had not flowed in months. There, huddled in the meager shade of a skeletal mesquite tree, was a boy. He could not have been more than 7 or 8 years old, his small frame dressed in worn buckskin. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, his black hair matted with sweat. He was Apache. Elias felt a familiar, unwelcome tightening in his gut, a reflex born of years of conflict and mistrust. The boy looked up, his dark eyes wide with terror, and for a moment, Elias expected him to bolt. He had seen that look in the eyes of Apache children before, a fear of the white man that was as old as the mountains around them. But the boy did not run. He scrambled to his feet, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was trying to be brave, but his lower lip trembled, and a fresh wave of tears spilled down his dusty cheeks. He took a hesitant step toward Elias, then another. "Please," the boy whispered, his voice a dry, hoarse rasp. He pointed a shaky finger back the way he had come, deeper into the labyrinth of sun-baked canyons. "Please, help!" Elias knelt slowly, making his movements small and deliberate, the way a man does around a spooked horse. He kept his hands in sight. "What is it, son? What is wrong?" The boy swallowed hard, his throat working. He looked from Elias's face to the canteen hanging from his saddle, his thirst a raw and visible thing. But he did not ask for water. His need was greater, more desperate. "My mommy," the boy choked out, the words cracking with grief and exhaustion. "My mommy is tied to a rock in the hot sun. Please, help her." The words struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. Tied to a rock, in this heat, it was not a punishment. It was a death sentence, slow and cruel. The image bloomed in his mind, ugly and immediate. He stood, his weariness forgotten, replaced by a cold, rising anger. He unslung his canteen and handed it to the boy, who grabbed it with both hands and drank greedily, water spilling down his chin. "Show me," Elias said, his voice low and steady, though his heart was pounding a hard rhythm against his ribs. "Show me where she is." The boy, whose name Elias would later learn was Tano, nodded, his eyes filled with a desperate, fragile hope. He led the way, his small legs moving with a renewed urgency. back into the shimmering heat. Elias followed, leading Jericho, who seemed to sense the grim purpose in his master's stride. They moved through a world of stone and fire, the sun relentless on their necks. The air was thick with the sharp, bitter scent of burned sage, a smell that clung to Elias's memory like a shroud. It was the smell of army camps after a raid, of a world set aflame. The canyons grew narrower, the rock walls amplifying the heat until it felt like walking through an oven. Tano scrambled over boulders and through thorny thickets that tore at his clothes, never looking back, his trust in the stranger absolute. Elias's shirt was plastered to his back, and sweat dripped from the brim of his hat, stinging his eyes more than once. Jericho stumbled on the treacherous, rocky ground, his breath coming in loud, ragged snorts. This was no place for man or beast. It was a place for dying. After what felt like an eternity, the boy stopped at the edge of a wide, flat clearing, a natural amphitheater of sun-bleached rock. He pointed with a trembling hand toward the center. "There," he whispered, his voice catching in a sob. And Elias saw her. She was staked out on a large, flat slab of sandstone that would have been hot enough to cook meat on. 4 lengths of rough hemp rope bound her wrists and ankles to stakes driven into cracks in the rock, pulling her limbs taut. She was young, perhaps no older than 20, and her deerskin dress had been torn at the shoulder. Her face was turned to the side, her long black hair fanned out against the stone, caked with dust. Her skin, the color of rich earth, was blistered and burned from the sun's relentless assault. Her lips were cracked and swollen, a faint, dark line of dried blood tracing a path from one corner of her mouth. She was not moving. For a terrible moment, Elias thought they were too late, but then he saw the faint, shallow flutter of her chest. She was alive, barely. A fury unlike anything he had felt in years surged through him. It was a clean, white-hot rage that burned away his fatigue and his cynicism, leaving only a raw and immediate need for justice. This was the work of men who called themselves civilized, men who went to church on Sunday and spoke of God's law, yet were capable of a cruelty that would shame a wolf. He dropped Jericho's reins and strode forward, pulling the Bowie knife from the sheath on his belt. The blade flashed in the blinding sunlight. He knelt beside the woman, his shadow falling across her face. He saw her eyelids flicker at the sudden reprieve from the glare. The ropes were tied with crude, tight knots, meant to hold, meant to torture. He sawed through the one binding her right wrist first, the hemp fibers parting with a dusty snap. The skin beneath was raw and bleeding, rubbed away by her struggles. One by one, he cut the ropes, his movements quick and efficient. When the last rope fell away, he gently tried to lift her. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight in his arms. A low moan escaped her lips, a sound of such profound pain that it made his teeth ache. He carried her to the sliver of shade offered by a rock overhang and laid her down carefully. Tano was beside them in an instant, his small hands hovering over his mother's face, afraid to touch her. Elias retrieved his canteen and a clean cloth from his saddlebag. He wet the cloth and gently dabbed at the woman's cracked lips. He let a few drops of water trickle into her mouth. She swallowed instinctively, a faint, convulsive movement in her throat. He continued, drop by drop, not wanting to make her sick. He wiped the dust and sweat from her face, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man whose hands were calloused and scarred. Her name, he knew, was Nayeli. He did not know how he knew. The name just seemed to settle in his mind as he looked at her face, which even in its current state, held a fierce, unyielding beauty. As he worked, the present faded, and the smell of burned sage pulled him back in time. He was 21 again, wearing the blue coat of a United States Army scout. He was younger, harder, and thought he understood the world in clear lines of black and white. He rode with a company of cavalry under a captain who saw the Apache not as people, but as obstacles to progress. vermin to be cleared from the land. They had tracked a band of Chiricahua to their village in a hidden valley. It was not a war camp. It was a place of families, of old ones and children. The attack came at dawn. Elias had been ordered to pinpoint the location, and he had done his job well. Too well. He sat on his horse on the ridge overlooking the valley, watching the slaughter unfold, and a piece of his soul had withered and died. He saw troopers ride down women who were trying to flee, their laughter sharp and cruel in the cold morning air. He saw them set fire to the wickiups, the flames consuming everything inside. He heard the screams, sounds he would carry with him to his grave. He remembered one moment with perfect, sickening clarity. A young woman, not much older than a girl, running with a baby in her arms. A soldier had caught her, torn the child from her grasp, and tossed it aside as if it were a sack of grain. The woman had fought back with the fury of a cornered cat, and the soldier had struck her down with the butt of his rifle. Elias had started to move, to shout, to do something, but the captain's hand had clamped down on his shoulder. "Stand down, Ward," the captain had said, his voice cold as river stone. "That is not our fight. We are here to observe." Observe. He had observed as they rounded up the survivors, their faces blank with shock and grief. He had observed the casual brutality, the utter lack of humanity. And he had done nothing. The guilt of that inaction had been his constant companion ever since, a poison that seeped into every corner of his life. It was why he had left the army, why he drifted from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. He was running from the man he had been on that ridge. Now, looking down at Nayeli, at the marks of a similar, senseless cruelty on her body, that old shame washed over him, fresh and bitter. This time, he would not just observe. Nayeli stirred in his arms, her eyes fluttering open. They were dark and deep, and for a fleeting second, they were lucid. They focused on his face, on his white skin and the unfamiliar lines of his features. Fear, raw and primal, flashed in their depths. Her lips parted, but only a dry rasp emerged. Then her eyes rolled back in her head, and she went limp against him, fainting from the pain and the heat. He held her for a moment, this stranger whose life was now inexplicably tangled with his own, and felt the weight of it settle upon him. He knew they could not stay here. Whoever had done this would likely come back to see their work finished, to watch the buzzards circle. He needed to find a place to hide, a place where she could recover. He looked around the desolate landscape, his scout's eye assessing the terrain. There, a series of narrow, winding canyons to the north, a place of shadows and hidden hollows where a man could disappear if he knew what he was doing. With a grunt of effort, he lifted Nayeli into his arms and carried her to his horse. Jericho stood steady as Elias carefully situated her in the saddle, her head resting against his chest. She was little more than dead weight. He mounted behind her, holding her securely with one arm. He looked down at Tano. The boy watched him with an unwavering gaze, his earlier terror replaced by a silent, solemn trust that felt heavier than any judgment. "Come on, son," Elias said gently. "We have to go." He helped the boy up, seating him in front of the saddle horn. Then, holding the woman and the child, he urged Jericho forward, away from the rock of torment and into the relative cool of the canyon's shadows. He found what he was looking for an hour later, a shallow cave, carved into the sandstone cliff faced by wind and time. It was not much, but it was defensible and hidden from the main canyon trail. He carried Nayeli inside and laid her on his bedroll. In the deepest, coolest part of the cave, the air inside was still and smelled of dry dust and ancient stone. Tano followed him like a shadow, his small hand clutching a fold of Elias's leather vest. He had not let go since they left the clearing. For the rest of the afternoon, Elias tended to her. He cleaned her wounds with water from his canteen, his touch as delicate as he could manage. The rope burns were deep, the skin rubbed raw and weeping. He applied a salve from a small tin in his saddlebag, a simple mixture of herbs and lard that his own mother had taught him to make. He forced more water between her lips, a few drops at a time, until he was satisfied that she was hydrated. All the while, Tano sat cross-legged a few feet away, watching every move Elias made, his dark eyes missing nothing. The boy's silence was profound, a vessel holding a grief too large for his small body. He trusted Elias now, with the desperate, all-in faith of a child who has no other choice. It was a trust Elias felt he had not yet earned. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the canyon rim, a fragile coolness settled over the land. The oppressive heat of the day finally broke, and the desert began to breathe again. Elias built a small, smokeless fire just inside the mouth of the cave, using dry wood that would burn hot and clean. He made a thin broth from a strip of jerky, boiling it in his small tin cup. He tried to get Nayeli to take some, but she was still unconscious, lost in a fevered haze. He managed to get a little into Tano, who ate with a quiet, mechanical necessity. Later, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers and a sliver of moon hung in the star-dusted sky, the coyotes began to cry. Their lonely, yipping calls echoed off the canyon walls, a wild and mournful song. Tano, who had finally succumbed to exhaustion, was curled up asleep on a saddle blanket near the fire, one hand still clutching the wooden handle of Elias's knife, which he had given the boy to hold. Elias sat by the entrance of the cave, his rifle across his knees, and listened to the night. He listened to the coyotes, to the whisper of the wind, and to the sound of Nayeli's breathing. It was shallow and labored, a fragile thread in the vast, dark silence. He watched the gentle rise and fall of her chest, a confirmation that she was still fighting, still holding on. A strange and unfamiliar tenderness stirred within him, a protective instinct that went deeper than pity. It was tangled up with the guilt of his past, with the memory of another Apache woman he had failed to help. He looked at Nayeli, a victim of the same senseless hate, and felt a quiet, fierce resolve harden within him. He did not know what the morning would bring, or the day after, but he knew, with a certainty that settled in the very marrow of his bones, that he would not fail this time. He would not just observe. The first light of dawn crept into the cave like a thief, pale and thin. It touched the stone walls, turning them from black to gray, and traced the edges of Elias's sleeping form. It was this light that woke Nayeli. For a moment, she knew only a deep, throbbing ache that pulsed through her entire body, a memory of fire and pain. Then came confusion. The roof above her was not the vast, brassy sky, but a low ceiling of rock. The air was cool and still, not scorching and alive with the buzz of flies. She was lying on something soft, a blanket. Her eyes darted around the small space, taking in the dead embers of a fire, a saddle resting against the wall, and the sleeping form of the boy. Tano, curled near the ashes. He was safe. The relief was a sharp, physical pang, but it was immediately followed by a wave of pure terror. A man lay sleeping near the mouth of the cave, his back to her, a rifle resting beside him, a white man. Memory returned in a brutal, chaotic flood. The angry shouts of the settlers, the rough hands grabbing her, the sharp bite of the ropes, the sun, a merciless eye burning down on her. The world had been a canvas of pain, and this man was one of them. He had to be. Perhaps they had grown tired of their sport and sent him to finish the job. Perhaps he had taken her from the rock for some other, darker purpose. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Survival was an instinct carved into her soul, a lesson taught by a lifetime of running and hiding. She had to fight. She had to get her son and run. She tried to push herself up, but her muscles screamed in protest. Her limbs were heavy, useless things, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. She ignored it, forcing herself to her knees. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Every movement was agony. She looked for a weapon, anything. Her eyes fell on a loose rock near her hand, about the size of a fist. Her fingers, weak and trembling, closed around its rough surface. She rose, swaying on her feet, the cave tilting around her. Using the wall for support, she staggered toward the sleeping man. He was a large silhouette against the growing light. In her fevered mind, he was every soldier who had burned her village, every settler who had looked at her with hate in his eyes. She raised the rock, her arms shaking with the effort, a guttural cry tearing from her raw throat. It was not a word, but a sound of pure, desperate rage, a scream in the Apache tongue that spoke of defiance and a refusal to die quietly. The sound woke Elias instantly. He rolled and came up on one knee in a single, fluid motion, his hand reaching for his rifle. He saw her, a wild figure in the half-light, her face a mask of terror and fury. The rock held high. He did not raise his weapon. He saw the weakness in her stance, the tremor in her arm. This was not an attack. It was the last, desperate act of a cornered animal. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and calm, holding his empty hands out where she could see them. "I am not going to hurt you." His voice, quiet and steady, seemed to confuse her. She hesitated, her dark eyes wide and searching. The fire in them wavered, replaced by a disoriented pain. The rock suddenly became too heavy. Her arm dropped to her side, and the stone fell to the cave floor with a soft thud. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed, a heap of worn deerskin and exhaustion. Elias moved to her side, but stopped a few feet away, giving her space. He did not touch her. Tano was awake now, scrambling to his mother's side, his small face etched with fear. He put a protective arm around her shoulders and glared at Elias with a ferocity that was startling in one so young. "Water," Elias said softly, gesturing to his canteen. He picked it up and set it down on the ground between them, then retreated back to the cave entrance, sitting with his back against the rock wall. He made himself small, non-threatening. He watched as Tano helped his mother sit up, her body slumping against his. The boy unscrewed the cap of the canteen and held it to her lips. She drank, her movements slow and pained. He gave them time, watching the sun climb higher, painting the canyon in hues of rose and gold. He could see the struggle in Nayeli's eyes. She watched him, her gaze sharp and intelligent, weighing him, judging him. The fear was still there, but beneath it, a sliver of cautious curiosity was taking root. She saw his dusty, worn clothes, the tired lines around his eyes. He did not look like the men who had tied her to the rock. There was a quiet sadness about him, a stillness that was at odds with the violence she associated with his kind. After a long silence, she spoke. Her voice was a dry whisper, but the words were clear. "Why?" she asked, the single English word costing her a visible effort. Elias understood. "Why did you help me?" "No one deserves to be left that way," he said simply. He met her gaze directly, wanting her to see the honesty in his eyes. It was wrong. She considered his words. Her head tilted slightly. She gestured weakly with her hand, a sweeping motion that encompassed the ropes, the sun, her pain. "They say, we take cattle." Her English was broken, pieced together from encounters at trading posts and army forts. "Did you?" Elias asked, not with accusation, but with a genuine desire to know. She shook her head, a slow, weary movement. "No, my people, we travel south, to the mountains, far from this place." She touched her own chest. "My husband is gone, only me, Tano." She looked at her son, and a universe of love and sorrow passed through her eyes. "We were looking for water. The men found us." Elias felt the familiar, bitter taste of disgust rise in his throat. It was an old story. A rancher loses a few head of cattle to wolves or his own foolishness, and the first person he blames is the one who looks different, the one who cannot speak to defend himself in a court of law. It was easier to blame the Apache than to admit your own failings. He knew some of the men who ran cattle in this territory. He had ridden with them, shared drinks with them. They were hard men, but he had never thought them capable of this kind of calculated cruelty. He had been wrong, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him despite the growing heat, that if those men found him here, with her, they would not ask questions. They would see him as a traitor to his own kind, and his life would be worth less than a spent cartridge. They would kill him for helping her. "You need to rest," he told her, his voice gentle. "You need food, medicine for the burns." Her pride flared in her eyes. She straightened her back, a difficult, painful motion. "We do not need your help." "Your son does," Elias replied quietly, nodding toward Tano, who was listening to their exchange with wide, anxious eyes. That struck home. Her gaze softened as she looked at the boy. For him, she would swallow her pride. For him, she would endure anything. She gave a slow, reluctant nod. Elias knew he could not treat her properly with what little he had. The salve would help, but the burns were bad, and she was weak from lack of food. He needed supplies from town. The thought made his stomach clench. Going into Socorro Gulch was a risk. He was a drifter, a man who kept to himself, and that alone was enough to breed suspicion. Showing up now, buying medical supplies and food for more than one person, would raise questions he could not afford to answer. But there was no choice. "I have to go," he said, standing up. "I will be back before the sun is high." Nayeli's eyes widened with a fresh wave of fear. He was leaving them. She thought he was abandoning them. Or worse, going to bring back the others. She started to speak, to protest, but he cut her off. "I will be back," he repeated, his voice firm with conviction. He looked at Tano. "You stay here. You keep your mother safe." He handed the boy his knife again. It was a gesture of trust, a promise. The boy took it, his small hand closing around the familiar wooden handle, and nodded gravely. Elias saddled Jericho and rode out of the canyon, keeping to the hidden arroyos and game trails, avoiding the main path. The ride to Socorro Gulch was a tense one, every shadow seeming to hold a threat, every gust of wind sounding like a horseman. The town was little more than a single dusty street lined with a dozen false-fronted buildings, a saloon, a general store, and a blacksmith. It was a hard place for hard people. He tied Jericho in the alley behind the general store and went in through the back. The storekeeper, a balding man named Silas with watery blue eyes, looked up from his accounts. "Ward." Silas grunted by way of greeting. "Did not figure you for being in town." "Needed a few things," Elias said, keeping his voice level. He moved through the cluttered aisles, picking up what he needed: a small sack of flour, coffee, bacon, and a can of peaches. Then he went to the shelves that held remedies and tonics. He found a jar of carbolic salve and bandages. Silas watched him. His eyes narrowed. "Someone get hurt?" "Horse threw a shoe." Elias lied smoothly. "Gouged my leg some." He forced a casual tone, but he could feel the storekeeper's suspicion like a physical weight. He paid for his goods, the coins clinking loudly in the quiet store. As he was about to leave, Silas spoke again. "Heard some of Henderson's boys were out your way yesterday," he said, wiping the counter with a dirty rag. "Said they caught one of the redskins that has been stealing their cattle." Elias's hand tightened on the sack. "Is that so?" "Yes, sir," Silas said, a smug look on his face. "A squaw. They taught her a lesson she will not soon forget. Left her out on the flats for the buzzards. Good riddance, I say." The casual cruelty of the words made Elias want to reach across the counter and throttle the man. But he held his temper in check, giving only a noncommittal grunt in reply. He walked out into the blinding sunlight, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He needed one more thing, a drink, not because he wanted one, but because the saloon was the heart of the town, the place where talk flowed as freely as the cheap whiskey. He needed to know what else was being said. The saloon was dark and smelled of stale beer. Sweat and sawdust. A few men were gathered at the bar. He recognized two of them as hands from the Henderson Ranch, big, coarse men named Cole and Jeb. He ordered a whiskey and stood at the far end of the bar, nursing the glass, listening. "Should have just shot her," Jeb was saying, his voice loud and slurred. "Would have been quicker." "Nah," Cole countered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the hot coals of the pot-bellied stove. "This way sends a message. The rest of them savages will think twice before running off our stock." "Still," Jeb mumbled, "it feels unfinished. I would like to ride out there, make sure the coyotes are eating well." A cold dread washed over Elias. They were talking about going back. He finished his whiskey in one gulp, the cheap liquor burning a trail down his throat. He set the glass down, turned, and walked out without a word, the sound of their ignorant laughter following him into the street. He rode out of Socorro Gulch like a man pursued, which, he supposed, he was. The disgust he felt for the men in the saloon was a hot, churning thing in his gut. They were not just cruel. They were proud of their cruelty. They had wrapped it in a flag of self-righteousness and called it justice. He was one of them by color of skin, but he felt a wider gulf between himself and them than the one that separated him from the Apache woman in the cave. When he got back to the canyon, he found Tano standing guard at the mouth of the cave, knife in hand. A small, fierce sentinel. The boy's face broke into a relieved smile when he saw Elias. Inside, Nayeli was sitting up, though she still looked terribly weak. She watched him with wary eyes as he unpacked the supplies. He set out the medicine, the bandages, and the can of peaches. He opened the can with his knife and offered it to her. She stared at it, then looked away, her chin held high. Her pride was a fortress. The only thing she had left, he understood. To take food from him was to admit defeat, to accept a debt she could never repay. Elias did not press her. He set the can down beside her and began to tend to her wounds. He cleaned the rope burns again, his movements slow and methodical. Then he carefully applied the strong-smelling carbolic salve. She winced when it touched her raw skin, but she did not cry out. She bore the pain with a stoic silence that spoke of a lifetime of hardship. As he wrapped her wrists and ankles in clean white bandages, he was acutely aware of the warmth of her skin, of the fragile bones beneath his fingers. He worked in silence. When he was done, he built up the fire and began to cook the bacon. The smell soon filled the small cave, a rich, savory aroma that spoke of sustenance and life. He watched her out of the corner of his eye. He saw the way her gaze kept flicking to the sizzling meat, the way she unconsciously wet her cracked lips. Hunger was a powerful, primal thing. It could break down the strongest walls. He served the bacon on his tin plate and set it, along with a can of peaches, near her again. He and Tano ate their own portions, saying nothing. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the sound of their chewing. Finally, with a small, almost imperceptible sigh of surrender, Nayeli reached for the plate. She ate slowly at first, then with a growing urgency, the food seeming to bring a spark of life back into her eyes. When she was finished, she looked at Elias, and in her dark eyes, he saw not defeat, but a flicker of something new, a grudging respect, a faint, fragile seed of trust. Days bled into one another in the quiet solitude of the canyon. The rhythm of their lives was simple, dictated by the sun and their shared need for survival. Elias hunted, bringing back rabbit and quail. Nayeli, as her strength returned, gathered edible roots and herbs she recognized from her own people's lore. Tano, caught between their two worlds, became a quiet bridge. In the long, quiet evenings, as the fire cast dancing shadows on the cave walls, they began to talk. It was not easy. The gaps in her English and his complete ignorance of her tongue made for a slow, stumbling kind of communication. But they found a way, using gestures, drawing pictures in the dirt, and relying on the shared human language of experience. Slowly, like peeling back the layers of an onion. They began to share the fragments of their broken lives. She told him of her people, the White Mountain Apache, and how they had been driven from their ancestral lands, pushed into a reservation where the soil was poor and the game was scarce. She spoke of her husband, a proud warrior named Chateau, who had been killed a year earlier in a skirmish with Mexican soldiers. Her voice was flat and devoid of emotion as she told the story, but Elias could feel the vast, empty space his death had left in her life. He, in turn, found himself speaking of things he had not uttered aloud in years. He told her about his wife, Sarah. She had been a schoolteacher from Ohio, full of life and laughter, who had followed him west with dreams of building a new life. But the land had been too hard, too unforgiving. A fever had taken her one winter, swift and brutal. There had been no doctor, no medicine that could save her. He had buried her himself on a small, windswept hill, in a grave marked only by a pile of stones because he had not even had the tools to carve her name into a wooden cross. As he spoke, he realized that the ache he carried for Sarah was not so different from the one Nayeli carried for Chateau. They were both haunted by ghosts, two lonely souls adrift in a land that had taken everything from them. In the small, firelit cave, surrounded by a world that would see them as enemies, they found a strange and unexpected solace in each other's company. Amid the shared grief and the quiet loneliness, something fragile began to grow. It was not yet love, not yet passion. It was a mutual respect for the resilience each saw in the other. It was a faint, hesitant trust, built one shared meal, one quiet conversation at a time. And beneath it all, there was a deep, resonant ache in the hollow part of their chests, a longing for connection that neither of them dared to name. The days settled into a quiet rhythm, marked by the slow crawl of the sun across the canyon rim. The initial urgency of survival gave way to the steady, patient work of living. The cave, once a temporary refuge, began to feel too much like a tomb. Elias knew they needed more. He began to build a shelter against the cliff face, a lean-to made from scavenged cottonwood poles and a lattice of ocotillo stalks, plastered with a mixture of mud and dry grass. It was hard work under the unforgiving sun. He labored for hours each day, his muscles aching, his hands raw, but the work was a balm to his restless soul. It was a constructive act in a life that had felt, for so long, like a series of retreats and destructions. Nayeli, her strength returning with each passing day, would bring him water. Tano would sit in the shade, watching him with solemn eyes, occasionally bringing him a perfectly shaped stone or a curious feather as a silent offering. The first time a patrol passed, they saw the dust cloud long before they heard the horses. Elias quickly herded Nayeli and Tano deep into the cave, standing guard at the entrance, his Winchester cocked and ready. He heard the faint jingle of harnesses and the low talk of men. They were searching the canyons, their voices carrying on the still air, speaking of escaped hostiles. The term, so clinical and dehumanizing, made Elias's blood run cold. He pressed himself against the rock, listening as the sounds faded, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat. He was an outlaw now, not by any crime he had committed, but by an act of compassion the world saw as treason. When the danger had passed, he turned to find Nayeli and Tano huddled together in the darkness. He saw the terror in their eyes, the familiar look of the hunted. He gave them a slow nod to show it was safe. But the incident left a pall over their small sanctuary. The world was out there, and it was looking for them. Despite the constant threat, life took on a fragile beauty. Elias began to see the desert not as his enemy, but as their provider. He taught Tano how to set snares for rabbits and how to read the tracks of quail in the sand. He took the boy to a hidden spring-fed pool, tucked away in a narrow slit canyon, where small, silvery fish darted in the clear water. He fashioned a small hook from a thorn and a line from a thread of his own shirt. He showed Tano how to bait the hook and cast the line, his large, calloused hands guiding the boy's small ones. Tano was a patient student, his focus absolute. When he caught his first fish, a tiny thing no bigger than his hand, his serious expression broke. A wide, incredulous grin spread across his face, and then, for the first time since Elias had met him, Tano laughed. It was not a loud sound, but a pure, bubbling well of joy that echoed in the quiet canyon. The sound struck Elias with a surprising force, warming a part of his heart he had thought long dead. It was the sound of a childhood being reclaimed from the ashes of tragedy. He also taught the boy to ride. Tano was a natural, his small frame light and balanced on Jericho's broad back. Elias would walk alongside, one hand on the boy's leg. As they made slow circles near the shelter, he found himself talking to the boy, telling him stories about the stars, naming the constellations his own father had taught him. He was filling a space he had never expected to occupy, the silence in his life being replaced by the questions and the newfound laughter of a child who was beginning to feel safe. As Tano opened up, so did Nayeli. The bandages came off her wrists and ankles, leaving behind pale, thin scars that were a permanent reminder of her ordeal. But the wounds inside were healing, too. The hunted look in her eyes was slowly replaced by a quiet watchfulness, and then by a gentle strength. She moved with a silent grace, her knowledge of the land far exceeding his own. She showed him which roots were good to eat, which leaves could be brewed into a soothing tea for a fever. She was a healer, a provider, a survivor. Her English improved with each passing day. She would point to objects, a rock, a tree, the sky, and he would give her the word. In return, she would teach him the Apache word, her voice soft. Ishii for rock, Tsi for tree, Ya for sky. Their languages were so different, yet they found a common ground in the simple act of naming the world around them. She began to mend his clothes, her small, nimble fingers working a bone needle with practiced skill. She would sit by the fire in the evenings, patching a tear in his shirt or reinforcing a seam, the picture of a wife tending to her husband's needs. The domesticity of the scene was so powerful, so natural, that it sent a sharp, unfamiliar pang of longing through him. One evening, the sky was on fire. The setting sun had painted the clouds in violent strokes of blood orange and deep purple. Elias had just returned from checking his snares, his hands and arms caked with the red dust of the canyon. He was tired, the heat of the day having settled deep in his bones. He went to the water barrel to wash, but Nayeli stopped him. She said nothing. She simply took the small wooden bowl, filled it with cool water, and knelt before him. She took his right hand in hers. Her touch was light, yet it sent a jolt through him, a current of warmth that spread up his arm. Slowly, reverently, she began to wash the dust from his hand, her fingers gently rubbing the dirt from his calloused knuckles and the deep lines of his palm. The act was so simple, so intimate, it stole the air from his lungs. He watched her, her head bent to her task, the fiery light of the sunset catching the blue-black sheen of her hair. He could see the fine, delicate bones of her wrist, the smooth curve of her neck. When she finished with one hand, she took the other, her touch just as gentle, just as deliberate. She was not just washing away the dirt of the desert. It felt as if she were cleansing him of something deeper, of the grit and grime that had settled on his soul. When she was done, she looked up at him. Her dark eyes, luminous in the fading light, met his. The world seemed to fall away. There was no sound but the frantic beating of his own heart. The space between them crackled with an energy that was both terrifying and undeniable. In her eyes, he did not see an Apache woman, an enemy, a savage, as the world would call her. He saw a woman of incredible strength and profound sorrow, a woman of deep kindness and a spirit the world had tried and failed to break. And he saw his own longing reflected there, an ache so deep it was a physical pain in his chest. The moment stretched, lasting an eternity. He wanted to lean down, to close the small distance between them, to touch his lips to hers. The desire was a living thing, a fire in his blood. But the ghosts of his past rose up to stop him. The memory of the blue-coated soldiers, the sounds of their laughter, the shame of his own inaction. He was a white man. She was Apache. The world had drawn a line between them in blood and hatred, a line that to cross meant death. He was her protector, not her suitor. To act on this feeling would be to betray the trust she had placed in him. He pulled his hand back, the movement abrupt, the connection shattered. He saw a flicker of hurt in her eyes before she masked it, lowering her gaze to the bowl of water in her hands. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice thick. He turned and walked away, needing to put distance between them, to fight the war that was raging inside him. He climbed a small rise overlooking their camp and sat, watching the last of the light die from the sky, leaving it bruised and dark. He was haunted by guilt for what his people had done to hers, and a strange, new guilt for wanting her. It felt like a violation, a final act of conquest. He thought of his dead wife, Sarah, and a wave of shame washed over him. Had he forgotten her so easily? But what he felt for Nayeli was different. It was not the gentle, comfortable love he had shared with Sarah. This was something wilder, fiercer, forged in violence and desperation. It was a love that was born not in spite of their differences, but because of them. He was drawn to her resilience, to the quiet dignity with which she bore her suffering. He did not know how long he sat there, lost in his turmoil. He only knew that she was suddenly beside him, a silent presence in the darkness. She did not touch him, but he could feel the warmth of her. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the stars prick holes in the black velvet of the night. "In my dreams," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I used to see their faces, the men who tied me to the rock. I dreamed I had a knife. I dreamed of revenge." Elias said nothing, his hands clenching into fists at his side. "But I do not have those dreams anymore," she continued, her voice soft and clear. "Now, I dream of this place. I dream of the quiet. I dream of Tano laughing." She turned her head to look at him, her profile a beautiful, strong silhouette against the starlight. "I do not want revenge, Elias. I only want peace." Her words cut through his guilt and confusion with the clean precision of a surgeon's knife. He looked at her and finally understood the true depth of her suffering. It was a chasm so deep that to even consider bridging it with violence was a waste of what little energy she had left. All she wanted was to live, to see her son grow up, to feel the sun on her face as a warmth, not a curse. And in that moment, his feelings for her solidified from a confusing, guilty desire into something solid and profound. It was a fierce, protective love that swept everything else away. The weather broke a few nights later. The air, which had been still and heavy for days, began to stir. The wind picked up, howling through the canyons, carrying the scent of rain and wet earth. Distant thunder rumbled, a low growl that grew steadily closer. They huddled inside the lean-to, the fire casting flickering shadows around them. Tano was asleep, wrapped tightly in a blanket. The wind tore at the shelter, and the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, spattering against the dry ground. Then the sky opened up. Rain came down in a solid, gray sheet, and the thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening explosion that seemed to shake the very foundations of the rock. A flash of lightning lit the small space, bleaching it white for a heartbeat. In that stark, momentary light, he saw Nayeli's face. Her eyes were wide, and she was looking at him, all the walls she kept so carefully around herself stripped away. He saw fear in her eyes, but also a raw, unguarded longing that mirrored his own. The storm was inside him now, as wild and untamable as the one raging outside. The thunder, the wind, the rain. It was all a reflection of the tempest in his own heart. All his reasons for staying away, all his guilt and his fear, were washed away in the deluge. Nothing mattered anymore but the woman sitting across from him, her presence a steady, warm anchor in the chaos. He moved toward her. She did not back away. He knelt in front of her, his body trembling with a force he could no longer control. He reached out a shaky hand and cupped her face, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. Another crash of thunder shook the ground, and in the ensuing silence, he heard her whisper his name. That was all it took. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate, hungry, a collision of two lonely souls who had been starving for a touch of human kindness. It was a kiss full of all the words they could not say, of all the pain they had endured. She answered him with an equal fire, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. They surrendered to the storm, to each other. In the intermittent flashes of lightning, their bodies were stark, beautiful sculptures, their passion a force of nature as powerful as the thunder that rolled through the canyons. It was a moment of pure, unthinking release, a desperate affirmation of life in the face of a world that wished them dead. When the storm finally passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and a sky full of quiet, exhausted stars, they lay tangled together in the blankets. Elias listened to the soft sound of her breathing, the steady rhythm a counterpoint to the frantic beating of his own heart. The morning came, soft and gray. The air was cool and smelled of wet sage and damp earth. Elias woke to find Nayeli watching him, her expression a complex mixture of tenderness and sorrow. The passion of the night had faded, and in its place, the cold, hard light of day brought with it a heavy reality. A deep shame settled in him, sharp and unwelcome. But when he looked at her, at the gentle curve of her lips, at the trust in her eyes, a wave of profound tenderness washed the shame away. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. She smiled, a small, sad smile. They did not need to speak. They both knew, in the heart of the storm, in the darkest part of the night, they had crossed a line. They had created something beautiful and fragile in their small, hidden world. But it was a world that could not last. They had crossed a boundary that the world outside, the world of patrols and prejudices, would never, ever forgive. The quiet days could not last. Elias knew it in his bones, a low, persistent hum of anxiety beneath the surface of their peaceful routine. The world was patient, but it did not forget. Their small supply of salt was nearly gone, and his coffee, the one small luxury he allowed himself, was down to its last few grounds. These were small things, but in the desert, small things kept you alive. The thought of riding back to Socorro Gulch was a bitter pill. The town was a viper's nest, and he had no desire to step on it again. But Tano needed the salt to preserve the meat they caught, and Elias needed the coffee to keep watch through the long, dark nights. He waited for a day when the sky was a hazy, washed-out blue, the heat less a hammer and more a suffocating blanket, hoping the oppressive weather would keep most folks indoors. He told Nayeli he was going for supplies, his voice carefully neutral. He did not want to alarm her, but he saw the shadow of fear pass across her eyes. She simply nodded, her hand going to the small of Tano's back as the boy played near the shelter. It was a gesture of instinct, of a mother ready to shield her child from a world she could not see but could always feel. Before he left, she pressed a small buckskin pouch into his hand. It was filled with dried herbs. "For the journey," she said. The gesture, so simple and caring, tightened a knot in his chest. This was what it felt like to have someone worry for your return. This was what it felt like to have a home to come back to. The ride was tense, every distant dust devil looking like an approaching rider. Socorro Gulch was as grim and sun-bleached as he remembered. He tied Jericho in his usual spot and slipped into the general store, his hat pulled low. He bought what he needed quickly, avoiding Silas's probing eyes, and paid with the last of his coins. He should have mounted up and ridden straight out of town, But a knot of horses hitched outside the saloon caught his eye. They were Henderson's stock. Cole and Jeb were in town. A cold, practical voice in his head told him he needed to know what they were saying. Knowledge was a weapon, and it was the only one he could afford. He pushed through the saloon's swinging doors, the familiar stench of stale whiskey and regret washing over him. He took a spot at the dark end of the bar, ordered a beer he had no intention of drinking, and listened. Cole and Jeb were there, holding court with a few other ranchers. Their voices were loud, full of the easy confidence of men who believed the world belonged to them. "Been a few weeks now," Cole was saying, his voice thick with irritation. "It is like she and the brat just vanished into thin air." "The buzzards must have got them," another man slurred. "No," Jeb said, slamming his empty glass on the bar. "No tracks, no sign, and my guess is she had help." He shot a suspicious look down the bar, his eyes passing over Elias without recognition. "Someone cut her loose. Someone helped her get away." Who in their right mind would help an Apache? "That is what we aim to find out," Cole said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone. He unrolled a piece of paper on the bar. Elias edged closer, pretending to be interested in a crack in the wooden floor. It was a crude, hand-drawn map of the territory, focusing on the labyrinth of canyons to the north, their canyons. "We figure she is holed up somewhere in here," Cole said, tapping a thick finger on the paper. "A man could hide an army in those rocks if he knew them well enough. We are putting together a proper hunt. Henderson is offering $50. Not for her alive, just for the proof." $50, the price of a good horse, the price of a woman's life. Elias felt a wave of nausea. These were not lawmen. They were a lynch mob with a map, turning their prejudice into a sporting event. "We ride at dawn tomorrow," Jeb announced to the room. "Any man with a rifle and a horse is welcome. Time we cleanse this territory for good." Elias did not hear any more. He slid his beer onto the bar, the coins for payment beside it, and walked out, his movements stiff and controlled. Outside, the sunlight was blinding. The casual, genocidal talk in the saloon had made the air feel thin, hard to breathe. He untied Jericho, his fingers fumbling with the knot, his mind racing. They were coming. Tomorrow. And they were heading straight for them. He swung into the saddle and rode out of town, not with the caution he had used on the way in, but with a desperate, reckless urgency. He pushed Jericho hard, the horse's hooves striking sparks against the stone. He had to get back. He had to warn her. When he finally galloped into their hidden camp, the horse lathered in sweat. Nayeli and Tano were waiting, their faces pale with alarm. He swung down from the saddle before Jericho had even come to a full stop. "We have to go," he said, his voice ragged. "Now. We have to pack what we can and ride deeper into the hills. We can lose them in the high country." He began grabbing their few possessions, the blankets, the cooking pot, the sack of supplies he had just bought. Nayeli watched him, her expression unreadable. "Who is coming?" she asked, her voice calm in the face of his panic. "A posse. From the town. They are hunting for you." He did not soften the words. There was no time. "They know you are in these canyons. They ride at dawn." He expected her to hurry, to share his fear, but she did not move. She stood perfectly still, a strange serenity settling over her features. She looked around the small camp, at the lean-to he had built, at the fire pit where they had shared so many meals. She looked at the familiar canyon walls that had become their sanctuary. "No," she said, the words soft but absolute. Elias stopped, turning to face her. "What do you mean? No, Nayeli, they will kill you. They will kill Tano." "I have been running my whole life," she said, her voice gaining strength. "My people ran from the soldiers. We ran from the Mexicans. I ran from the men who tied me to the rock. I ran with you to this place." She took a deep breath, her shoulders straightening. "I will not run anymore. My spirit is tired of it. "This is not running, it is surviving," he argued, his voice raw with desperation. "This is not a fight we can win." "To live as prey is not living," she countered, her dark eyes flashing with a fire he had never seen before. "Every day we would be looking over our shoulder. Every night we would sleep with fear. Tano would grow up knowing nothing but the life of a hunted animal." She shook her head. A final, resolute movement. "No. This place, this is the first home I have had since my village was burned. It is the first place my son has laughed in a year. If my life is to end, let it end in my home. I will not die in the dirt, fleeing like a frightened rabbit." He stared at her, speechless. Her courage was a thing of terrifying beauty. It was illogical. It was a death sentence. But he understood it. He saw the deep, soul-crushing weariness in her, the exhaustion that came from a lifetime of being told you did not have a right to exist. To stand and face her fate was the only way for her to reclaim the dignity they had tried to strip from her. His desire to protect her warred with his profound admiration for her strength. And in the end, admiration won. He could not force her to run. To do so would be to break the very spirit he had come to love. "All right," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of her decision. "We will not run. We will hide. We will find a better place, deeper in the rocks, a place we can defend." They spent the rest of the day moving their camp. Elias found a place he had scouted weeks before, a narrow, defensible ravine that could only be accessed by a single, tight passage between two massive boulders. It was a natural fortress, with a small spring bubbling up from the rock and a high ledge that offered a commanding view of the canyon below. It was a good place to make a stand. It was a good place to die. The next few days were a strange and precious gift. They were living on borrowed time, the shadow of the approaching posse hanging over them. Yet these were some of the most peaceful hours they had ever shared. Knowing that their time together might be short, stripped away all pretense, leaving only a raw and honest affection. They spoke in low whispers, their words full of a tenderness that had no need for grand pronouncements. Tano seemed to sense the shift, staying close, his small hand often finding its way into Elias's or Nayeli's. They shared stolen hours of peace. Elias would watch Nayeli as she ground mesquite beans into flour, the rhythmic motion of her hands a soothing balm to his frayed nerves. She would watch him as he sat on the ledge, his rifle across his knees, his gaze fixed on the canyon approach, a silent guardian. In the evenings, they would sit close together, Tano asleep between them, and share stories in hushed tones, their laughter a fragile sound in the vast, waiting silence. It was a brief, painful illusion of the family they might have been in a kinder world. One afternoon, while Nayeli and Tano were gathering berries near the spring, Elias took out his knife and a piece of dry, smooth ironwood. He began to carve. His hands, usually so steady with a rifle, felt clumsy at first, but as he worked, a shape began to emerge from the dark wood. He carved a hawk, its wings outstretched, its head turned to the sky. To him, it was a symbol of freedom, of a spirit that could not be caged. It was a symbol of her. He spent hours on it, smoothing the wood with a piece of sandstone until it felt warm and alive in his palm. He drilled a small hole through the top and threaded a thin leather cord through it. That evening, as the moon began to rise, painting the canyon in shades of silver and black, he gave it to her. He simply held it out on his open palm. She looked at it, her fingers tracing the delicate lines of the carved wings. "It is a hawk," he said quietly, "so it can watch over you, keep you safe." She looked up at him, and he saw that her eyes were filled with tears. She did not try to wipe them away. She took the charm and pressed it to her heart, her hand covering it as if to absorb the love and the hope he had carved into it. She looped the cord around her neck, the small wooden bird resting in the hollow of her throat. "No one has ever made anything for me before," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The posse came on the third night. Elias heard them first. The faint, telltale clink of a horseshoe on rock, carried on the night wind. He was on the ledge, his body instantly alert. He peered into the moon-drenched canyon below and saw them. A dozen riders, moving slowly, their rifles held ready. They were dark shapes in the moonlight, a silent, creeping menace. He scrambled down from the ledge and into their small camp. Nayeli was awake, her eyes wide. She had heard it too. He went to her, pulling her and the sleepy, disoriented Tano into the deepest recess of their hiding place, a small hollow in the rock that was almost a cave. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice urgent. "Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." Tano clung to his mother, his face buried in her dress. Nayeli looked at Elias, her face a pale oval in the darkness. There was no fear in her eyes, only a deep, abiding love and a terrible sadness. She reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers cool against his skin. "Elias," she began, but he cut her off. He took her face in his hands, his gaze locking with hers. "I will protect you," he swore, his voice a low, fierce promise. "I will protect you both, I swear it." He kissed her then, a hard, desperate kiss that tasted of fear and finality. Then he turned, grabbed his rifle and a box of cartridges, and climbed back to the ledge. He laid himself flat on the cold stone, the rock biting into his skin. He could see them clearly now as they entered the ravine below. He recognized Cole's bulky frame and Jeb's lanky one, and then his blood ran cold. He saw another man, one whose posture and way of sitting a horse were achingly familiar. The man turned his head, and the moonlight fell on his face. Caleb Thorne. They had served together as scouts. They had shared campfires and stories, had saved each other's lives more than once. What was he doing here? Elias rested the barrel of the Winchester on a rock outcropping, his hands steady despite the frantic pounding of his heart. He was a good shot. He could pick them off, one by one. But the sound of the first shot would give away his position, and they would have him pinned down. He had to make the first shot count. He sighted on Cole, the leader. His finger tightened on the trigger, but then Caleb dismounted, walking forward to examine the ground. He was looking at their tracks. He was the best tracker Elias had ever known. He would find them. There was no doubt. "They went this way," Caleb called out, his voice echoing in the quiet ravine. It was the same voice that had once told jokes by a campfire in the Dragoon Mountains. The sound of it made Elias's stomach turn. The men started moving toward his position. There was no more time. He had to stop them. He shifted his aim from Cole to Caleb. His mind screamed in protest. Not him, anyone but him. But Caleb was the threat. Caleb was the one who would lead them straight to Nayeli and Tano. He took a deep, shaky breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, the explosion deafening in the enclosed space. Below. Caleb stopped, a look of surprise on his face. He touched his chest. Then his knees buckled, and he fell to the ground without a sound. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then chaos erupted. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as the posse opened fire, their bullets screaming off the rocks around Elias. He fired back, working the lever of the Winchester, his movements mechanical. He was no longer thinking, only reacting. He fired at the flashes of light, at the dark shapes that scattered for cover. He heard a man scream, saw another fall. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the ozone scent of ricocheting lead. The fight was a blur of noise and violence. He did not know how long it lasted. It felt like an eternity, and an instant all at once. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. He heard the sound of horses, of men retreating in a panic, leaving their dead and wounded behind. Silence descended on the ravine, a heavy, ringing quiet. The only sound was the echo of the last gunshot, fading into the night. Below him lay three still forms, One of them was Caleb. Elias lowered the rifle, his arms feeling like lead. He looked at his hands. They were steady, but inside, something had irrevocably broken. A vast, empty chasm had opened up in his soul. He had protected Nayeli. He had protected Tano. But to do it, he had killed a man he once called a friend. He had looked at a piece of his own past and destroyed it. He had won the battle. But in the process, he felt as if he had lost himself. The wind carried the scent of pine and retribution. In the town of redemption, a place that had long forgotten the meaning of its name, the news of Sheriff Miller's death spread like a fever. It was a simple story told in saloons and from church pulpits, a story stripped of nuance and truth. A good man, a lawman, cut down by the traitor Elias Ward, a man who had chosen the company of a savage over his own kind. Within a week, the posters appeared, nailed to trading posts and stagecoach stations across the territory. The paper was cheap and the ink bled in the rain. But the message was stark. A crude drawing of Elias, his face gaunt and shadowed, stared out from the sheet. Below it, in bold, angry letters, were the words, "Wanted, Elias Ward, for murder and treason." And beneath that, a description that stung him more than any bullet could: outlaw and Indian lover. He saw one himself, tacked to a splintered post marking a crossroads they had reached after 3 days of hard riding. He sat on his horse, staring at the caricature of his face while Nayeli watched him, her own expression a mask of sorrow. He was no longer a man with a name, a history. He was a label, a sin boiled down to 2 words. He ripped the poster from the post, the paper tearing in his fist, and spurred his horse onward, away from the world that had condemned him without a trial. They fled deeper into the Badlands, a brutal, sun-scorched wilderness that offered no comfort. The landscape became their enemy, a third pursuer as relentless as the law and the bounty hunters who would surely follow. They rode until the horses were slick with sweat and foam, their ribs showing like stark warnings. They abandoned the animals when one finally collapsed, its breath rattling in its chest, and continued on foot, carrying only what they could on their backs: a near-empty canteen, a rifle with a handful of shells, and a small pouch of dried meat that dwindled with each passing day. They moved through a world of rock and dust. They crossed riverbeds that were nothing more than highways of cracked earth and bleached stones, their thirst a living thing in their throats. They navigated canyons where the sun beat down on them from above and reflected up from the pale rock below, trapping them in an oven of their own making. Elias led them through the skeletal remains of an old mining camp, the shacks leaning into one another like tired drunks, their windows like vacant eyes. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the gravel and the whisper of the wind through the derelict structures. Tano, walking between them, held tightly to his mother's hand, his small face smudged with dirt and streaked with silent tears. He did not complain, a stoicism that broke Elias's heart. Hunger became a dull, constant ache in their bellies. Exhaustion settled deep into their bones, a weariness so profound it felt as though they were dragging their own graves behind them. They slept in short, fitful bursts, huddled together for warmth in the lee of a rock outcropping as the desert temperature plummeted with the setting of the sun. Elias would stay awake for long stretches, the rifle across his lap, watching the stars wheel across the immense, indifferent sky and listening for the sound of hoofbeats that would signal their end. He would look at Nayeli, her face softened in sleep, and at Tano, curled against her side, and a fierce, protective fire would burn away his fatigue. He had made this choice. He would see it through. But the wilderness was not done with them. The days of relentless sun gave way to a sudden, biting cold. A storm blew in from the north, not with rain, which would have been a blessing, but with a raw, damp wind that cut through their worn clothes and chilled them to the marrow. They had no real shelter, only a shallow cave whose mouth seemed to invite the wind inside. It was there that Nayeli began to shiver. At first, Elias thought it was only the cold, and he wrapped his own coat around her, pulling her and Tano close. But the shivering did not stop. By morning, her skin was hot to the touch, a dry, burning heat that spoke of a deep fever. Her dark eyes were glassy, unfocused. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed back into his arms, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Elias's exhaustion. He was a tracker, a scout. He knew the land, but he knew nothing of healing. He had seen this fever before, in soldiers left too long in the damp cold. It consumed a person from the inside out.
"Elias,"
she whispered, her voice a dry rasp.
"Tano."
"I am here," he said, his voice thick. "We are both here. You need to rest." He knew they could not stay. To remain was to wait for death or capture. He made a desperate choice. He fashioned a sling for Tano from a blanket, settling the boy on his back where he could hold on. Then, he gathered Nayeli into his arms. She was lighter than he would have imagined, her body frail against his chest. But as the miles wore on, she became a dead weight, an anchor of burning flesh and bone. He carried her across miles of dust. The world narrowed to the shuffling sound of his own feet, the burn in his lungs, the ache in his back and shoulders. The sun beat down, and he felt the heat of her fever seep into him, as if they were two candles melting into one. He spoke to her, his voice a low murmur against the wind. He told her stories of his childhood, of the green hills of Ohio that seemed a world away. He described the taste of cold well water, the smell of summer rain on a dirt road. He whispered her name over and over, not as a sound, but as a prayer, a plea sent up to a sky that had long ago stopped listening. "Nayeli, stay with me! Nayeli!" Tano was silent on his back, his small arms wrapped tightly around Elias's neck. He could feel the boy's fear, a trembling that matched the shivering of the woman in his arms. He was carrying their whole world, and he could feel it failing. In her fever, Nayeli drifted in a burning sea between worlds. The pain and the shivering were distant, a storm on a far horizon. She was walking in the village of her youth, the scent of cedar smoke and roasting corn in the air. Her people were there, their faces unlined by sorrow. Her mother, her father, and then he stood before her. Chaitan, the husband of her heart, the father of her son. He was as she remembered him, tall and strong, his eyes kind. He was not angry. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a profound sadness that mirrored her own. He did not speak with his mouth, but she heard his voice in her spirit. "You have suffered enough. My wife, your heart was a cold stone. This man, he has warmed it. He has protected our son. I have betrayed you," she thought, the guilt a familiar weight. "You have survived," he answered. "Survival is not a betrayal. Our son needs a father. He needs a protector in this broken world. My fight is over. Yours is not. Love him. Let your heart be whole again. Live." He reached out and touched her cheek, his hand cool and soothing on her burning skin. And then he faded, dissolving into the light, leaving her with a sense of peace she had not felt since the day he had died. A tear, hot and real, slid from the corner of her eye and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She was no longer torn. She knew her heart. The knowledge was a small, quiet mercy in the midst of her agony. Just as Elias felt his own strength give out, as his vision began to blur at the edges and his legs threatened to buckle for the last time, he saw it, looming out of the shimmering heat haze, atop a low mesa, were the crumbling adobe walls of a building, a mission, one of the old Spanish chapels, long abandoned to the elements. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar sensation, surged through him. He did not know if he could make it, but he knew he had to try. He lowered his head, focused on the crumbling bell tower that reached like a skeletal finger toward the sky, and he walked. Each step was a battle, each breath a victory. He half stumbled, half crawled up the shallow slope to the mission, his body screaming in protest. The heavy wooden doors had long ago rotted away, leaving a dark, gaping entrance. Inside, the air was cool and still. The roof was a lattice of broken timbers, with great patches open to the sky. Pigeons cooed from the rafters, their soft calls echoing in the silence. Sunlight streamed through the holes, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny spirits. Pews lay in splintered heaps, and at the far end, a simple stone altar stood against the wall, covered in a thick blanket of dust. On its surface, the stubs of a dozen candles were melted into waxy pools, hardened over time into permanent, silent offerings. He gently laid Nayeli down on the floor in a patch of shade, her head pillowed on his bedroll. He gave her the last of their water, tilting the canteen to her cracked lips, watching her swallow with pained effort. He set Tano down, and the boy immediately curled up beside his mother, his small hand resting on her arm. For 2 days, Elias nursed her. He found a small spring behind the chapel, the water muddy but life-giving. He soaked his kerchief and laid it on her forehead, trying to draw the fever out. He hunted, ranging farther than he dared, and managed to shoot a single scrawny rabbit, which he cooked over a small, smokeless fire and made into a weak broth. He spooned it into her mouth, a few drops at a time, willing his own strength into her. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. He awoke to find her watching him, her eyes clear for the first time in days. The burning heat was gone from her skin. She was terribly weak, her face hollowed out by the illness, but she was alive. Relief washed over him so completely that it left him dizzy. He knelt beside her, taking her hand in his. It felt small and fragile.
Elias,
She whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am here," he said, his throat tight. "Rest now. You are safe." They stayed in the broken chapel as she slowly regained her strength. It became their sanctuary, a fragile bubble of peace in a world that wanted them dead. During the day, sunlight painted shifting patterns on the dusty floor. At night, stars glittered through the ruined roof, and they felt as though they were sleeping in the palm of God's hand. In the quiet of that place, the walls between them finally dissolved. They spoke of their pasts, of the lives they had led before their paths had crossed. He told her of his family's farm, of his disillusionment with the army, of the emptiness he had carried for so long. She told him of her village, of her love for Chaitan, of the crushing grief that had silenced her for a year after his death. Tano, seeing his mother slowly returning to him, began to act like a child again. He explored the corners of the chapel, chasing lizards and collecting interesting stones, his laughter a sound so precious it felt like a miracle. One evening, a soft twilight filled the chapel, turning the adobe walls the color of roses. Tano was asleep, nestled in a bed of dry grasses they had collected. Nayeli was sitting up, leaning against the altar, her gaze fixed on the fading light in the sky. Elias sat beside her, watching her face, the way the soft light traced the line of her jaw and illuminated the quiet strength in her eyes. The feeling he had kept locked away in his chest for so long, the feeling that had driven him from redemption, that had pushed him to carry her across the desert, was now an unbearable pressure, a truth that had to be spoken. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. She turned to look at him, her expression questioning. "Nayeli," he began, his voice low and rough with emotion. "When I thought I was going to lose you, out there, in the desert, I realized something. I am not running from the law. Not really. I am not even running from the men who will come for me. I am running toward this, toward you." He took a breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I have spent my life feeling like a ghost, just moving through the world. But with you, with Tano, I feel alive. I feel like I have a purpose. What I am trying to say is—" He paused, searching for the right words, but all he found was the simple, terrifying truth. I love you. I do not know what tomorrow will bring. I do not know if we have a week or a day, or just this one moment. But I know that I would rather die here, beside you in this ruin, than live 100 years without you in the world outside. Tears welled in Nayeli's eyes and spilled down her cheeks. They were not tears of joy. He saw it instantly. They were tears of profound, heart-wrenching despair. A sob escaped her, a broken, wounded sound that echoed the brokenness of the chapel around them.
Oh, Elias,
She wept, her voice choked.
I feel it, too, my heart. You have healed my heart. But do you not see? Your love is a death sentence. My love is a cage. We have found this small, beautiful thing in a world that will never allow it to live. The world outside. It is still there. It is waiting, and it will destroy anything it does not understand. She leaned into him, her tears soaking his shirt, and he held her, the full weight of their tragedy settling upon him. She was right. Their love could not stop bullets. It could not reason with hatred. It was a fragile candle flame in the path of a hurricane. They were two people from different worlds, and all they had done was create a new world too small to survive. They did not hear the horses until it was too late. The soft thud of hooves on the dirt outside, the jingle of a harness, the low murmur of men's voices. Elias's head snapped up. His blood ran cold. He scrambled for his rifle, his movements swift and silent. He peered through a crack in the crumbling wall. Soldiers, a dozen of them, their blue uniforms stark against the dusky landscape. They were dismounting, forming a perimeter, their rifles held at the ready. They were trapped. Panic flared. But Nayeli's hand on his arm was steady, her touch calming. Her eyes, though filled with sorrow, were clear and resolute. In that instant, she was no longer a victim of fate, but a shaper of it. She looked from the soldiers outside to her sleeping son. Under the altar,
She whispered, her voice urgent and sharp. Hide him. Elias hesitated for only a second before he understood. He scooped up the sleeping Tano, who stirred but did not wake. The space beneath the heavy stone altar was small, cloaked in deep shadow. He gently placed the boy inside, pushing him far back into the darkness.
Do not make a sound,
he whispered to the sleepy child.
No matter what you hear. Do you understand? It is a game.
Tano, confused but obedient, nodded slowly. When Elias turned back, Nayeli was standing by the entrance. She had pulled her blanket around her shoulders, her dark hair falling around her face. She looked like a queen, regal and unafraid. No, Elias said, moving toward her. We fight, together. She put a hand on his chest, stopping him, her eyes locked with his, and in their depths, he saw a love so fierce and a sacrifice so complete that it stole his breath. They want you, Elias Ward, the outlaw, the Indian lover. If they find me, an Indian woman, with you, they will kill us all without a second thought. Tano will have no one. What are you saying? He asked, though he already knew.
They are soldiers, not bounty hunters. They follow orders,
she said, her voice impossibly calm. I will tell them you took me by force, that you are long gone. Maybe they will believe me. Maybe they will take me back to the reservation. It is a chance. It is the only chance for you and for Tano. I will not leave you, he said, his voice breaking. You will, she insisted. You will go out the back, take the boy when it is safe, raise him, teach him the things you know. That is how you will love me now. She rose on her toes and kissed him. It was not a passionate kiss, but one of finality, a kiss of farewell that tasted of tears and dust. It held all the words they would never get to say, all the life they would never get to live.
I love you, Elias,
she whispered against his lips. Before he could answer, before he could argue or pull her back into the shadows, she turned away from him. She smoothed her hair, took a deep, steadying breath, and stepped out of the chapel's darkness into the fading light, her arms raised in a gesture of surrender. her body a shield for the two men she loved. "Hold your fire!" The voice of a corporal, sharp with authority, cut through the tense quiet. Nayeli stood in the open, her hands raised, her figure silhouetted against the deep purple of the twilight sky. "It is just the woman."
"I am alone," Nayeli called out, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt in her soul. "The man you seek, Elias Ward, he is gone. He forced me with him, but he fled north 2 days ago when my son and I fell ill."
Elias crouched in the shadows of the chapel, felt his world tilt. Her lie was seamless, delivered with the conviction of a desperate prayer. He watched the soldiers, their rifles still aimed at her, their faces a mixture of suspicion and relief. For a heart-stopping second, he thought they might believe her. He saw a few of them exchange glances, their posture relaxing slightly. The corporal, a young man with a face too soft for his uniform, took a hesitant step forward. "Where is the boy?" he asked.
"He is sleeping inside," she answered. "He is weak with fever. Please, we mean no harm."
From the back of the formation, a man with sergeant's stripes on his sleeve spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dust. He was older, his face a roadmap of hard-bitten campaigns and casual cruelty.
"She is lying,"
he growled, his voice carrying in the still air. "An Apache will lie as soon as breathe. He is in there with her. Flush him out." The corporal looked flustered. "Sergeant, my orders were to take him alive if possible." "Your orders were to apprehend a murderer," the sergeant snapped, raising his rifle. "And that is what we are going to do." The world exploded in a flash of orange and a deafening crack of gunfire. It was not a warning shot. The bullet tore through the air and slammed into the adobe wall just inches from Nayeli's head, showering her with dust and splinters. She flinched, but did not scream, did not run. She stood her ground, a solitary, defiant figure. That was all it took. The sight of her, so close to death, shattered the last thread of Elias's control. A primal roar of fury and terror ripped from his throat, an animal sound of pure protective rage. He burst from the chapel entrance, the rifle in his hands, not to kill but to draw their fire, to pull their eyes away from her. "Leave her alone!" He was a blur of motion, a specter of vengeance charging into the open. The soldiers, startled by his sudden appearance, reacted with instinct. A volley of shots erupted. The noise of physical blow against the stone walls of the mission. Elias felt a searing, white-hot pain rip through his left shoulder, spinning him around. The impact knocked the rifle from his grasp, sending it clattering onto the hard-packed earth. He staggered, fighting to stay on his feet, his gaze locked on Nayeli. Another bullet found him, a brutal punch to his thigh that buckled his leg beneath him. He collapsed to his knees, the dust rising around him like a shroud.
"Elias!"
Her scream was his name, a sound of pure agony. She forgot the soldiers, forgot the plan, forgot everything but the man bleeding in the dirt. She ran to him, her feet flying over the ground that separated them. The sergeant smiled, a cruel, thin line. "See, told you he was here." Elias looked up through a haze of pain to see her coming toward him. "No!" he gasped, trying to wave her back. "Nayeli, run!" But she did not listen. She reached him and fell to her knees in front of him, turning her back to the line of rifles. She wrapped her arms around him, shielding his head and chest with her own slender body as if her flesh and bone could stop the lead that was sure to follow. She pressed her cheek to his, her hair falling around his face like a dark curtain. "It is all right," she whispered into his ear, her voice frantic and soothing all at once. "I am here. I am with you." He could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his own chest. He could smell the scent of wood smoke and wild herbs in her hair. For one impossible moment, cocooned in her embrace, the sound of the world faded away. There were no guns, no soldiers, only the two of them, kneeling in the dust under a canopy of stars. The sergeant raised his rifle one last time, taking careful aim. The single shot that followed was sharp, definitive. an exclamation point at the end of their story. Elias felt her body jolt against his, a violent, unnatural shudder. A soft gasp escaped her lips, a puff of warm air against his skin. Her arms, which had been holding him with such strength, went limp. Her head grew heavy on his shoulder. He felt a warm wetness spreading across his shirt, a sticky tide that he knew was not his own blood. She pulled back slightly, her movement slow, her dark eyes searching for his. There was no pain in them now, only a strange, luminous calm, a profound and final peace. A small, sad smile touched her lips. She raised a trembling hand to his cheek.
"The sun,"
she whispered, her voice so faint he could barely hear it. It was a thread of sound, the last of her life unspooling into the desert air.
"The sun does not burn me anymore."
Her hand fell away. The light in her eyes extinguished, leaving behind two dark, empty pools that reflected the twilight sky. Her body sagged, and he caught her, pulling her tight against him as she breathed her last. She was gone. A sound tore from Elias's throat, a sound of such utter devastation that it made a few of the younger soldiers flinch and look away. It was not a cry of anger or of pain, but of a soul being ripped in two. He cradled her lifeless body, rocking back and forth on his knees in the dust, his face buried in her hair. He sobbed, great, shuddering gasps that shook his entire frame, his tears carving clean tracks through the grime and blood on his face. The world had ceased to exist. There was only the unbearable weight of her in his arms and the vast, echoing emptiness she had left behind. Rough hands seized him, pulling him away from her. He fought back with a strength born of grief, but he was wounded and outnumbered. They dragged him to his feet, his injured legs screaming in protest. He did not care. His eyes never left her form, lying so still on the ground. They hauled him away like a sack of grain, his boots scraping trails in the dirt. He kept his gaze fixed on her until the blue uniformed bodies of the soldiers blocked his view, and all he could see was the indifferent sky she was now a part of. Inside the mission, hidden in the absolute darkness beneath the cold stone altar, a little boy pressed his hands over his ears, his small body curled into a tight ball. He had obeyed. He had played the game. He had not made a sound, not even when the world outside had torn his own to pieces. He stayed there long after the soldiers' voices and the sound of their horses had faded, long after the silence returned, deeper and more terrifying than before. He remained in the dark, alone with the ghosts. It was 3 days later when the boy, Tano, was found. He had finally emerged from the chapel, driven by a thirst that was stronger than his fear. He was sitting in the doorway, staring blankly at the 2 mounds of freshly turned earth a short distance away, when a man on a mule crested the mesa. The man was a wandering preacher named Silas Blackwood, a gaunt figure with kind eyes who traveled the territories armed with a tattered Bible and an unwavering, if often tested, faith. Silas saw the boy, the vacant look in his eyes, and the small, carved wooden bird clutched in his hand. He saw the tracks of soldiers and the dark stains in the dust. He did not need to ask what had happened. He had seen the aftermath of such encounters before. He dismounted, offered the boy water from his canteen, and sat with him in silence as the sun began to set. Tano did not speak, but when Silas gently motioned for him to come, the boy took his outstretched hand. The preacher took him east, away from the Badlands, away from the graves and the ghosts. He gave him a new name and a new life, but for the rest of his days. The boy clutched the wooden charm, the last piece of a love story he was too young to understand but would never forget. Elias Ward was taken to the territorial prison at Yuma, a hellhole carved from rock and baked by the sun. His trial was a formality. He was condemned not for killing a sheriff in what was a clear act of self-defense, but for the unforgivable crime of loving across a line that society had drawn in the sand. He did not speak in his own defense. He did not speak at all. The fire in him had been extinguished in the dust of that mission courtyard. They threw him in a cell, a stone box with a single slit for a window that offered a view of nothing but a blank wall. His wounds healed into ugly, puckered scars. But the wound inside him only festered. Day after day, he would sit on his cot, staring at the wall. Using a sharpened piece of rock he had found in the yard, he began to carve, slowly, painstakingly. He etched her name into the stone, Nayeli. It was his only conversation, his only prayer, his only reason to see the sun rise one more time. He never left that prison alive. A few years later, an entry in the warden's log noted simply that prisoner 347, Elias Ward, had died in his sleep from what the doctor called a failure of the will to live. Years turned into decades. The desert reclaimed the abandoned mission, its adobe walls slowly crumbling back into the earth from which they were made. The soldiers were forgotten, the sergeant's cruelty buried with his bones, the preacher's kindness a fading memory. But stories, true stories, have roots that run deeper than mesquite trees. Travelers, cowboys driving cattle, and prospectors searching for fortune would sometimes stop to rest under a gnarled old mesquite that grew a mile from the mission ruins. There, they would find two graves, side by side, marked by simple wooden crosses that someone, long ago, had taken the time to erect. One cross bore the crudely carved initials E.W. The other was bare, but burned into the wood was a circle with rays extending from it, an Apache symbol for the sun. And they would hear the legend. The story spread from lonely campfires to bustling saloons, changing with each telling but always retaining its heart. They told of the stoic cowboy who found a captured Apache woman and, instead of claiming her bounty, untied her ropes. They whispered of how he turned his back on his own world for her, and how she, in the end, gave her life for his. It became a story of the territory, a piece of the land itself, a legend of a love that was truer and stronger than the laws of men or the hatred in their hearts. Many more years passed. The West was tamed, fenced in, and crisscrossed with railroads. The era of cowboys and untouched wilderness was gone, living on only in dime novels and fading photographs. One spring afternoon, an old man rode a horse to the place where the mesquite tree stood, its branches now thick and heavy with age. He was tall and weathered, his face a testament to a long and difficult life, but his eyes were clear. In his hand, he held a small, worn wooden bird, its features smoothed by a lifetime of touch. Tano, now a man named Thomas, who had a family and a life far to the east, had finally come back. He dismounted and walked to the two graves. He knelt, placing a hand on each mound of earth. The wind whispered through the branches of the mesquite, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. He stayed there for a long time, the silence stretching, as the memories of a terrified little boy merged with the understanding of a grown man. He finally understood the choice his mother had made, the sacrifice she had embraced. He understood the love that had given him a chance to live. He looked up at the vast, open sky, the sun warm on his face. It was not a burning sun. It was a gentle, life-giving warmth. He thought of his mother, not as she was in that last, terrible moment, but as he remembered her from before, her laughter like music, her love a fierce and protective fire. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that she had found her peace. He leaned close to the grave marked with the symbol of the sun and whispered to the wind, his voice carrying the words out across the endless desert. She is free now. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.